This just blew the entire sports world wide open. Colin Cowherd didn't whisper it. He didn't soften it. He didn't hide behind polite analyst language or safe media phrasing. He looked straight into the camera on national television and delivered a statement that is now echoing across every corner of basketball discourse in America. Caitlin Clark doesn't need a new system. She needs a better coach. And just like that, the conversation around the Indiana Fever shifted in real time. Because this wasn't a casual opinion buried in a longer segment. This was a direct, no-fluff, high-impact verdict aimed straight at the heart of the Fever's leadership, and specifically at head coach Stephanie White. Cowherd didn't just praise Caitlin Clark's talent. He framed her as something bigger, a generational force being placed inside a system that doesn't fully understand how to unlock her. And the implication was explosive. If Clark is struggling at times, if Indiana looks inconsistent, if moments of brilliance are followed by confusion, the problem isn't the player. It's the structure around her. It's the coaching philosophy. And it's the refusal to fully build the offense around what she actually is, a once-in-a-generation engine that changes the geometry of every possession. But what makes this moment even louder is the timing. Because Indiana is already under pressure. The fan base is divided. Every game is being dissected. Every rotation decision is being questioned. And now one of the most watched voices in sports media has stepped in and basically said, "This is not working, and everyone can see it." And if that wasn't enough, the reaction inside the WNBA ecosystem has already started to ripple. Because when a national figure like Cowherd shifts the narrative this hard, it doesn't stay a debate anymore. It becomes a full-blown controversy. And what happens next inside the Fever organization might determine not just the season, but the entire direction of the franchise going forward. To understand why Colin Cowherd's comments hit so hard, you have to understand what the Indiana Fever situation has slowly turned into over time. Because this isn't just about one game. It's not even just about one coach. It's about a franchise that has been placed under a microscope so intense that every decision now feels like it carries long-term consequences. And at the center of it all is Caitlin Clark. From the moment she entered the league, Clark was never going to be treated like an ordinary rookie. She arrived with unprecedented attention, massive expectations, and an already established identity as one of the most influential players in women's basketball history. Every arena she entered changed its energy. Every broadcast built its coverage around her presence. And every opposing defense adjusted its entire game plan around stopping her first. That kind of gravitational pull doesn't just affect opponents. It reshapes internal team dynamics as well. Because when a player becomes the focal point of everything, media coverage, fan attention, ticket sales, and game planning, the structure around that player has to evolve quickly. Not gradually, quickly. And that's where the Indiana Fever found themselves under pressure from day one. Stephanie White entered the situation with a strong coaching reputation. She's experienced. She understands professional systems. She has credibility within league circles and has been trusted in multiple coaching environments. But coaching a rising superstar who dominates attention is a different challenge entirely. It requires something beyond structure. It requires adaptation. And adaptation in professional basketball is often where tension begins. Because most coaches have a system they trust, a philosophy built over years of experience. Ball movement, equal opportunity offense, defensive accountability, role balance. These principles work well in traditional team environments. But when you introduce a player like Caitlin Clark into that structure, the system starts to get tested in real time. Clark is not a wait-for-your-turn type of offensive player. She operates best when she is reading the floor in motion, initiating early offense, controlling tempo, creating shots for others through gravity. That means the offense naturally becomes more centralized around her decision-making. And that is where philosophical tension begins. Because centralization of one player can feel uncomfortable inside a system built around distribution. Over time, that tension becomes visible in small moments. Rotations that don't fully align with offensive rhythm. Possessions where the ball moves away from the primary playmaker too quickly. Late game sequences where decision-making feels divided. and post-game press conferences where language becomes carefully neutral instead of individually focused. This is where the media narrative begins to form, not from one incident, but from accumulation, a series of moments interpreted through the lens of expectation versus execution. And once that narrative begins, it feeds itself. On the outside, fans begin to interpret every coaching decision through a single question. Is this helping Caitlin Clark maximize her impact? Or is it limiting it? And that question becomes louder every time Indiana plays a close game. Every time a fourth-quarter possession is debated. Every time a substitution is questioned. Every time a press conference avoids naming specific standout performances. Meanwhile, inside the broader WNBA ecosystem, something else is happening. Clark's presence is not just a basketball story. It is a business and cultural phenomenon. Attendance spikes. Broadcast ratings shift. Road arenas feel like home environments for Indiana. Merchandise demand increases across markets. That level of influence amplifies every discussion around her usage. Because now it's not just about wins and losses. It's about maximizing the impact of the league's most visible player. And that creates pressure from multiple directions. Fans want freedom and dominance. Media wants clarity and narrative alignment. Coaching staff wants structure and control. Opponents want disruption. So when Colin Cowherd enters the conversation, he is not speaking into a vacuum. He is stepping directly into an already active debate that has been building since Clark's arrival. And his framing doesn't introduce a new idea, it sharpens an existing one. His central argument is simple but powerful. If a player is this impactful, the system should adapt around her, not restrict her. And that immediately reframes Stephanie White's role in the discussion. Not as a coach managing a roster, but as a coach managing a generational talent. That distinction matters because it changes how every decision is interpreted. Rotations become philosophical statements. Play calls become system validation. Press conference language becomes organizational signaling. And that is exactly why this topic has become so explosive. Because once a player reaches a certain level of influence, everything around them becomes symbolic. Every decision carries meaning beyond the court. Every quote becomes part of a larger narrative battle. And now, with Cowherd publicly entering that narrative and taking a firm stance, the tension has moved beyond fan discussion. It has entered mainstream sports debate territory, which means it is no longer contained within Indiana. It is national. And when a storyline becomes national, the pressure multiplies. Because now every game is not just a game. It becomes evidence. Evidence for or against a growing argument that is now shaping the perception of an entire franchise. And that is exactly where things stand heading into the next phase of this controversy, where every possession, every substitution, and every press conference answer is no longer just analyzed, but scrutinized under a spotlight that is only getting brighter. The pressure didn't explode all at once. It built slowly, one possession at a time. One press conference answer at a time, one nationally televised segment at a time, until suddenly, it stopped feeling like a basketball discussion and started feeling like a full-scale narrative war. The turning point came with a game that should have been remembered for basketball. Instead, it became remembered for interpretation. Caitlin Clark delivered another high-impact performance. Stretches of elite shot-making, clutch scoring runs, and the kind of offensive control that shifts momentum instantly. There were moments where she looked completely in command. Deep threes that changed the energy in the arena. Transition reads that created instant scoring opportunities. And fourth-quarter sequences where Indiana's offense visibly tightened around her decision-making. But what happened after the game is where everything started to fracture. Because instead of the conversation staying on performance, it shifted immediately toward messaging. And messaging is where modern sports controversy is born. In the post-game press conference, Stephanie White was asked directly about Clark's impact. The question was simple, straightforward, focused on the late-game scoring burst that kept Indiana competitive and ultimately shaped the outcome. Everyone expected a direct acknowledgement, a moment of clarity, a clean recognition of performance. But the response didn't land the way many expected. White praised the team. She highlighted collective effort. She emphasized shared responsibility on both ends of the floor. She framed the victory, or even the competitive stretch, as a group outcome rather than an individual takeover performance. And that is where the first major twist formed. Because in professional sports media, what a coach chooses not to say often becomes louder than what they do say. And in this case, the absence of direct acknowledgement became the story. Clips from the press conference began circulating almost immediately, not because of what was controversial on the surface, but because of what fans and analysts interpreted underneath. Some viewers focused on tone, others focused on wording, others focused on the pattern, noticing that similar language had been used in previous press conferences following strong individual performances. A narrative began forming across social platforms. Why was individual impact being absorbed into collective language? Why was standout performance being generalized? And why did it feel like the most visible player on the floor was being verbally blended into the system? At the same time, Cowherd's national segment was already circulating. His comments about coaching fit, system limitations, and superstar utilization began merging with the press conference reaction. And when those two narratives collided, the situation escalated. Because now it wasn't just one media voice. It was multiple layers reinforcing the same interpretation from different angles. Then came the first unexpected twist. A secondary clip from the same post-game availability surfaced. In it, White was asked about another player's contribution, specifically a role player who had a solid scoring stretch early in the game. And in that moment, her language shifted noticeably. She offered direct praise. She highlighted specific actions. She named impact clearly and without hesitation. That contrast changed everything, because suddenly, fans and analysts weren't just reacting to what was said, they were comparing how it was said. And that comparison created friction in the narrative. The discussion evolved rapidly. If certain performances are acknowledged individually, why are others framed more collectively? Is it intentional? Is it contextual? Is it stylistic? Or is it being misinterpreted entirely under the pressure of a growing media storyline? At this stage, the conversation stopped being purely basketball-based. It became psychological interpretation, and that's where modern sports narratives become volatile. Because interpretation has no hard boundary. It expands based on perception. Meanwhile, inside the game context itself, Indiana's performance metrics were telling a very different story. The offense functioned in bursts, the defense struggled in stretches, and momentum shifted multiple times depending on lineup combinations and tempo control. Clark's usage remained central during key runs, but the system around her continued to fluctuate in stability. That inconsistency became another focal point, not because it was unusual in a young season, but because it was now being viewed through a magnified lens of expectation. Every imbalance became symbolic. Every adjustment became analyzed. Every possession became a data point in a growing debate. And then came the second twist, the one that pushed the entire situation further. A brief sideline moment during a late game sequence began circulating online. It showed visible frustration during a stoppage, body language, gestures, and communication between players and coaching staff that fans immediately began interpreting in different ways. Some described it as normal competitive intensity. Others described it as frustration boiling over. Others connected it back to the broader coaching narrative already circulating in media discussions. And once that clip entered the conversation, the storyline shifted again. Now it wasn't just about press conferences. It wasn't just about Cowherd's commentary. It wasn't just about offensive systems or player usage. It became about alignment or perceived lack of it between star player, coaching approach, and organizational direction. At this point, the narrative had fully expanded beyond its original scope. 3 separate layers were now overlapping: national media commentary, press conference interpretation, in-game emotional moments, and each layer was reinforcing the other in different ways. The result was predictable in modern sports media. A single coherent storyline began to emerge, even if it wasn't explicitly confirmed anywhere. A storyline centered on tension, on fit, on communication style, and on whether the current system fully maximizes the talent at the center of it. But the most important part of this twist is not what is proven, it's what is believed. Because in today's sports environment, perception moves faster than confirmation. And once perception solidifies, it becomes extremely difficult to reverse. And as this story continues to spread, one thing becomes clear. The conflict is no longer confined to a single game or a single quote. It has expanded into a larger debate about identity, leadership, and direction, and it is only getting louder with every passing moment. By the time the next wave of discussion hit, this was no longer just a reaction to a game. It had turned into a full-blown media cycle, one that kept feeding itself with every clip, quote, and replay that surfaced online. And at the center of it all was still the same question that wouldn't go away. Is this system fully unlocking Caitlin Clark? Or is it unintentionally holding her back? The escalation didn't come from one single moment. It came from accumulation, a series of small observations that, when stitched together by analysts, fans, and media personalities, started forming a much larger narrative shape. First, Cowherd's comments continued gaining traction. What started as a segment became a talking point. What became a talking point became a debate. And what became a debate turned into a wider sports conversation about coaching philosophy in modern basketball. Clips of his statements were replayed repeatedly. She needs a better coach. The system should adapt to the superstar. You don't restrict a generational player. Each line was dissected independently, then recombined into broader interpretations. And suddenly, it wasn't just about Indiana anymore. It was about how modern teams should handle elite offensive engines. Then came the second wave reaction analysis. Former players and commentators began weighing in with varying degrees of agreement and caution. Some supported the idea of greater offensive centralization. Others emphasized system balance and long-term sustainability. But even the disagreement added fuel. Because disagreement means attention, and attention means amplification. Meanwhile, Indiana's internal performances continued providing material for interpretation. In-game sequences showed both extremes, moments of fluid offensive control, and stretches of inconsistent execution. Runs where spacing looked elite, followed by possessions that stalled under pressure. And every one of those moments was now being tied back into the coaching debate. But the most explosive development came from something much more subtle. A pattern noticed during broadcast breakdowns. Analysts began pointing out how Indiana's offensive rhythm appeared to shift depending on how quickly the ball moved through Clark's hands. When she initiated early action, the offense looked faster, sharper, more decisive. When possessions slowed or became more segmented, the rhythm of the team changed noticeably. That observation alone wasn't controversial, but the way it was interpreted became the spark. Because now the conversation wasn't just about talent. It was about structure. And structure is where coaching narratives become unavoidable. At the same time, replay segments from post-game media sessions resurfaced again. White's language, previously analyzed for tone, was now being studied for consistency. Fans noticed patterns in phrasing, team effort after standout performances, collective resilience after scoring bursts. Everyone contributed in games defined by individual takeover moments. Separately, none of these phrases were unusual. Together, they began forming a narrative framework that viewers started interpreting as intentional messaging. Then came the most significant reveal moment in the escalation phase, a compilation clip. It showed multiple post-game interviews side by side, Clark's standout performances, followed by neutral team-framed coaching responses, followed by other players receiving more direct praise in similar situations. The comparison wasn't explicitly stated, but it didn't need to be. The visual contrast did the work. This is where the situation shifted from commentary to interpretation warfare. Because once people start comparing language patterns, every word becomes weighted. Every omission becomes meaningful. Every acknowledgement becomes significant, and at this point, the narrative expanded again, this time beyond coaching. It began to include organizational identity. Questions started emerging across discussions. Is Indiana still in a building phase? Is the system still being defined? Is this about philosophy or adaptation speed? Is the team trying to balance structure with star usage, or struggling to align both at once? These questions mattered because they reframed everything. Instead of coach versus player, the debate expanded into system evolution, franchise direction, long-term identity, and that broader framing intensified everything. Because now every possession wasn't just evaluated in isolation. It was evaluated as part of a larger trajectory. Then came another subtle but impactful moment. Broadcast commentary during a live segment highlighted how Indiana's offensive possessions looked more efficient when Clark controlled early tempo. The discussion wasn't framed as criticism. It was framed as observation. But observation, once repeated across multiple platforms, becomes narrative reinforcement. And narrative reinforcement leads to perception shifts. At the same time, fan reaction continued intensifying online, not just in disagreement but in polarization. One side argued, the system needs more freedom. Elite players should dictate offense. Flow improves when Clark initiates consistently. The other side argued, team balance is essential. Systems take time to develop. Overcentralization creates long-term issues. Both sides were reacting to the same games, but interpreting them through completely different lenses. And that divergence is what made the situation escalate further. Because once interpretation splits, consensus disappears. And once consensus disappears, every new game becomes a new argument. Then came the final escalation layer, a renewed focus on sideline communication and in-game interaction patterns. Observers began replaying sequences where body language, substitutions, and timeout decisions were analyzed frame by frame. Nothing new was necessarily happening, but everything was now being reinterpreted through an increasingly sensitive lens. And that sensitivity created volatility, because even neutral moments began to feel charged when viewed through the existing narrative framework. By the end of this escalation phase, the situation had transformed completely. It was no longer just about a coach, a player, or a segment. It had become a layered debate involving media interpretation, system philosophy, performance analysis, and fan-driven narrative momentum. And once a storyline reaches this level of expansion, it stops being controlled by any single quote or game. It begins to evolve on its own. And that evolution is exactly what sets up the next stage of this controversy. By the time this story reached its peak circulation online, it wasn't just sports fans reacting anymore. It had become a full-scale media debate spreading across analysts, former players, commentators, and everyday viewers who all had one thing in common. They were trying to make sense of a situation that suddenly felt bigger than a single game or a single quote. The first wave of reaction came from mainstream sports commentary spaces. Not all voices agreed with Colin Cowherd's framing, but almost everyone acknowledged the same underlying tension. Caitlin Clark's presence changes how the game is played and how it is discussed. That alone keeps the conversation alive. Some analysts focused on performance reality. They pointed out that Indiana's offensive possessions often look most dangerous when Clark controls tempo early. They highlighted her ability to shift defenses with deep range, quick decision-making, and transition pressure. From that perspective, the argument wasn't emotional, it was structural. Other analysts pushed back. They emphasized that basketball systems require balance, that no single player can sustain full offensive control across an entire season without defensive consequences, and that long-term success often depends on shared responsibility, not centralized usage. But even that disagreement didn't reduce attention. It increased it, because the more perspectives emerged, the more the debate expanded instead of narrowing. Former players entering the discussion added another layer of nuance. Some supported the idea that elite guards thrive when given full offensive control. Others stressed the importance of adaptability between coaching philosophy and roster construction. And nearly all of them acknowledged one thing: Clark's impact forces teams to make decisions they wouldn't normally have to make. Meanwhile, fan reaction was significantly more emotional. On social platforms, the conversation split into clearly defined camps. One side argued that Indiana should fully embrace Clark as the centerpiece of everything they do offensively. The other side argued that building sustainable winning systems requires discipline, structure, and shared responsibility. And the friction between those two perspectives created constant engagement, because every new game became evidence for one argument or the other. Then came broadcast reaction segments. During highlight breakdowns, analysts repeatedly returned to a few key themes: how Indiana's offense flows under pressure, how spacing changes when Clark initiates early action, how late-game execution depends on decision-making speed. These were not emotional takes. They were observational, but repeated observation becomes narrative reinforcement over time. One of the most discussed points across coverage was how Indiana's rhythm fluctuates depending on tempo control. When possessions are quick and decisive, the offense looks fluid and dangerous. When possessions slow or become segmented, scoring opportunities become harder to generate. That contrast became a focal point for debate. But the most interesting reaction came from within the broader coaching discussion space. Not targeted at individuals, but at philosophy. Analysts began debating a larger question: what does it mean to build a modern offense around a generational perimeter creator? Some argued that systems must evolve around elite playmakers. Others argued that systems should remain stable regardless of individual talent levels. And that philosophical divide became the core of the entire discussion. Because at that point, the debate was no longer just about Indiana. It was about basketball identity itself. Even neutral coverage started reflecting that shift. Headlines focused less on outcomes and more on interpretation. How Indiana uses its star guard, system versus superstar debate intensifies. Coaching philosophy under the microscope. Each framing choice subtly reinforced the idea that something structural was being examined. And that framing matters. Because once media language shifts from game analysis to system analysis, the narrative expands beyond a single team. It becomes a league-wide conversation. At the same time, internal team performances continued fueling discussion. Indiana's offense still showed moments of brilliance, but inconsistency remained part of the picture. And inconsistency, when paired with high expectations, always attracts interpretation. Fans noticed that too. They didn't just look at wins or losses. They looked at how wins happened, how possessions were structured, how rotations flowed, and how late-game sequences were managed. That level of attention creates pressure not just on players, but on coaching decisions. Because every choice becomes part of a visible public record that gets analyzed in real time. And as the conversation continued expanding, one thing became clear: this was no longer a short-term reaction cycle. It was an ongoing narrative loop. Every game adds new footage. Every press conference adds new interpretation. Every analyst segment adds new framing. And every fan reaction adds new emotional weight. By this stage, the situation had fully transformed into something self-sustaining. A cycle where performance fuels discussion, discussion fuels interpretation, interpretation fuels pressure, and pressure fuels more performance scrutiny. And that cycle shows no sign of slowing down. Because once a storyline reaches national-level attention, it doesn't shrink back easily. It only evolves, which leads directly into what comes next. A final turning point moment where one more revelation is enough to completely shift how the entire narrative is being understood. The most dangerous part of a storyline like this is not the controversy itself. It's what happens when the narrative starts feeding on its own momentum. And that's exactly where things were headed now. Because just when it looked like the conversation had stabilized into a predictable coaching debate, something else happened that completely changed the direction again. It started with a single replay angle, a late-game sequence that had already been discussed, already been analyzed, already been clipped and reshared across social media. But this time, someone slowed it down further and noticed something that hadn't been part of the earlier discussion. It wasn't a dramatic foul. It wasn't a heated argument. It wasn't a scoring play. It was something much smaller, a substitution pattern, a sequence of rotations during a critical stretch of the fourth quarter that didn't match what viewers expected given momentum on the floor. At first glance, it looked normal. Players in, players out. Standard coaching rotation management. Nothing unusual. But in the context of everything that had already been discussed, usage patterns, system debates, coaching philosophy, and media interpretation, that small detail suddenly took on a different meaning. Because fans started asking a new question. Why were certain lineups being used in specific momentum windows and not others? And once that question entered the conversation, everything reopened again. Analysts began rewatching entire stretches of the game, not just highlights, full sequences, possession by possession, rotation by rotation. And what they noticed didn't create a single answer. It created multiple interpretations. Some argued it was normal experimentation. Others said it reflected rigid system structure. Others suggested it was situational decision-making under pressure. But the key issue wasn't the answer. It was the fact that multiple explanations were now plausible at the same time. And that uncertainty is what keeps narratives alive. Meanwhile, post-game press availability added another layer of tension. Because when asked again about late-game decision-making, the response was once again measured, structured, and team-oriented. No emotional deviation. No deviation into individual praise. Just consistent framing around collective execution. And consistency is where perception becomes locked in. Because once a communication pattern repeats enough times, audiences begin to interpret it as intentional messaging, whether or not that is actually the case. At the same time, the star player continued producing high-impact moments on the floor, deep shots, transition control, late-clock decision-making, the kind of plays that immediately change crowd energy and broadcast tone. But now even those moments were being filtered through the larger debate. Instead of just being highlights, they became evidence points in a broader argument about usage, system design, and coaching alignment. And that is when the final twist of this phase emerged. Not from a quote, not from a broadcast segment, but from the growing realization across media coverage that this entire situation was no longer about one coach or one player. It had evolved into something structural, a franchise identity question. Because once a team becomes defined by how it uses its most important player, every decision becomes symbolic. Every rotation becomes meaningful. Every press conference becomes interpretive material. And every game becomes part of a larger narrative test. And that's where the cliffhanger sits, right on the edge of something bigger. Because now the questions are no longer small. Is this just early season adjustment? Is this growing pains within a new system? Or is this a fundamental mismatch between philosophy and talent? And the uncomfortable truth is that nobody has a definitive answer yet. Not analysts, not fans, not media voices, and not even the team itself as far as public messaging shows, which means the story is still open, still unfolding, still evolving with every possession, every interview, and every lineup decision. And that's what makes the next stretch of games so critical. Because whatever happens next won't just be viewed as a result. It will be viewed as a signal about direction, about trust, about system identity, and about whether everything being debated right now was just noise, or the beginning of a much larger shift that nobody fully recognized in real time. And as the league moves forward, one thing is certain. Every Indiana Fever game from this point on is no longer just a game. It's a referendum on philosophy, on leadership, and on how a franchise decides to build around one of the most watched players in modern basketball. And that is where this story leaves off, for now. Because the next game isn't just another matchup. It's the next chapter in a narrative that is already far from finished. And that's where things sit right now. Not settled, not resolved, not cooled down. Just hanging in the air like a storm that hasn't fully broken yet. because this isn't just a highlight cycle anymore. It's not just a post-game reaction. And it's definitely not just another coaching debate that fades after a week. This has turned into something that keeps rebuilding itself every time the Indiana Fever step on the floor. Every possession now feels like it carries extra weight. Every substitution gets watched twice. Every press conference answer gets replayed and reinterpreted. And every big scoring run immediately turns into a new argument about what it means for the bigger picture. And whether people agree with the criticism, the praise, or somewhere in between, one thing is impossible to ignore. This team is the most closely watched story in basketball right now. So the real question isn't just about one game. It's not just about one coach. And it's not just about one player either. It's about direction. It's about identity. And it's about whether everything we're seeing is part of a growing championship foundation or a situation still searching for its exact shape. And that's where the conversation shifts to you, because this is no longer just something happening on the court. It's something being interpreted by millions of people in real time. So here's what needs to be answered. Do you think Caitlin Clark should be the unquestioned focal point of the offense every single night, with everything built around her natural tempo and scoring gravity? Or do you think the current system approach is the correct long-term strategy, even if it takes time for everything to fully click? And the bigger question, is all this media attention overblown? Or is it actually revealing something real about how this team is being structured? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of debate that doesn't have one clean answer. And depending on how the next few games go, every opinion here might start looking either completely right or completely wrong. If you want the next breakdown the moment the next game shifts the storyline again, make sure you're subscribed and stay locked in. Because this situation isn't slowing down. It's building. And the next chapter could change the entire conversation all over again.